Welcome to the Deep Dive. I want you to imagine for a moment that you spend your life creating something so profoundly moving.
Truly revolutionary.
Yeah, revolutionary. Something that permanently changes how society views an entire concept, a concept as massive as war.
Right.
But the catch is, you die just days before the world ever realizes your genius. Sounds like the plot of a film. But for the subject of today's deep dive, it was harsh reality.
It was indeed.
Today we are looking at a comprehensive biographical and historical text on the English poet and soldier Wilfred Owen.
Yes.
And the mission of our deep dive today is to really explore how a young man with basically no money for university became the definitive, piercing voice of the First World War. We're going to see how trauma, a faithful friendship, and a hidden identity shaped his timeless art.
It is a remarkable journey we have ahead of us today because this isn't just, a dry recounting of history.
Not wrong at all.
It is really a story about the violent collision of these grand romantic ideals with the gritty, horrific reality of the trenches. It's about how experiencing the worst of humanity can sometimes forge an artistic voice that echoes for generations. If you look at the letters provided in our source material, you can actually trace the exact week his tone changes from arrogant snobbery to total psychological devastation.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting right at the beginning.
Right.
Wilfred Edward Salter was born in March 1893, up in Shropshire. At first, things were relatively comfortable for his family. They lived in a nice house owned by his grandfather.
But that didn't last.
No, it didn't. When his grandfather died in January 1897, the house was sold. The family's financial situation took a really severe hit. They ended up moving frequently, lodging in the back streets of Birkenhead while his father worked for a railway company, and later moving to Shrewsbury.
And that financial struggle is crucial to understanding his early trajectory.
Because he was smart.
Incredibly bright. In 1911, he actually passed the matriculation exam for the University of London.
But there's a catch.
Yeah, he didn't get the first-class honors required to secure a scholarship. And a scholarship was literally the only way he could have afforded to attend university.
Wow.
It was a massive closed door. It left him scrambling for a way to continue his intellectual life.
So instead of going off to university, the sources show he ends up working as a lay assistant to the vicar of Dunstan near Reading.
Yes.
He got free lodging and some tuition for the entrance exam in exchange for his work. But this period from September 1911 to February 1913, it really shifted his worldview, didn't it?
It did, and in a way that planted the seeds for his later poetry. His time at the Dunstan parish led to a really profound disillusionment with the church.
Because he was dealing with actual poverty.
Exactly. He wasn't just doing administrative work. He was dealing directly with the rural poor. He became heavily disillusioned with the ceremony of the church when contrasted with its total failure to actually provide material aid for those starving parishioners. This questioning of faith and institutional failure is a theme that would heavily seep into his later war poetry. He would eventually go as far as to write poems commenting on the crucifixion of Christ, claiming that the love of God seemed dying in the mud of France.
Before the war, though, his early poetic influences were deeply rooted in the Romantics.
Oh, absolutely.
If you read his early drafts, he is heavily channeling John Keats and Percy Bysshe Shelley. Very floral, beautiful imagery.
Very traditional.
Yeah. He actually discovered his poetic vocation around 1904 during a childhood holiday in Cheshire. But fast forward a bit to 1913, and he is working as a private tutor, teaching English and French in Bordeaux, France.
Which is an interesting detail.
It is. When the First World War broke out, he didn't rush to enlist right away. In fact, he even considered joining the French army because he felt so culturally tied to the country. I mean, have you ever had a life plan completely derailed, like missing out on university, only to find it sets the stage for an unexpected, greater calling?
That's a great question. The transition from a young tutor reading Keats in a French villa to a soldier enduring gas warfare is just jarring.
Completely.
And the sources point out that his return to England wasn't driven by some sudden burst of jingoistic fervor. It was a slow build of societal pressure, a sense of duty, and perhaps a bit of guilt watching others go. By October 1915, he enlisted in the Artists' Rifles, and by June 1916, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Manchester Regiment.
I was reading the excerpts from his letters home during this period, and there is a really surprising detail.
The snobbery.
Yes. When he first took command, Owen was quite the snob. In a letter to his mother, he described his own troops, the men he was leading, as expressionless lumps.
Expressionless lumps.
Yeah, he seemed to hold them in contempt for what he called their loutish behavior. He was very much playing the part of the refined, educated officer looking down on the working-class enlisted men.
But that initial arrogance, that class-based distance he tried to keep from his men, it was shattered almost immediately upon reaching the front lines in France.
The reality hit hard.
Very hard. The source details specific, horrific experiences that broke down those barriers. First, he fell into a deep shell hole in the dark and suffered a severe concussion.
Which is terrifying enough.
Right. But shortly after returning to the line, in an even more traumatic event, he was caught in the blast of a trench mortar shell. He spent several days lying semi-conscious on a railway embankment, pinned down by enemy fire.
Oh my God.
And he was right amongst the scattered remains of a fellow officer.
Just the sensory overload and the pure psychological terror of that are hard to even fathom.
The military at the time barely understood that toll. They slapped the label neurasthenia on it, which is the medical term for what we now call shell shock, and he was removed from the front lines. They shipped him to Craiglockhart War Hospital in Edinburgh for treatment.
And what's fascinating here is how this psychological breaking point, this diagnosis of shell shock, was actually the catalyst for his true creative genius to emerge.
It really was.
Craiglockhart wasn't just a hospital, it was an incubator. Because it's at Craiglockhart where the most pivotal encounter of his life happens. He meets a fellow patient, the already established poet, Siegfried Sassoon.
A huge moment.
Owen completely hero-worshipped him. The source notes that Owen told his mother he was not worthy to light his pipe. He even wrote to Sassoon saying, "You have fixed my life, however short."
The dynamic between them was incredibly fruitful. But we also have to credit Owen's doctor at Craiglockhart, Arthur Brock. Dr. Brock practiced something called ergotherapy, or a work cure.
Work cure, right.
As part of his treatment, Brock encouraged Owen to translate his trauma, specifically the terrifying visual experiences he was reliving in his nightmares, directly into poetry.
So he couldn't run from it.
Exactly. Instead of avoiding the memories, he had to face them on the page. Sassoon, who was being influenced by early Freudian psychoanalysis through his own doctor, aided Owen in this process. Sassoon showed Owen, by example, what poetry could actually do when applied to modern warfare.
Sassoon essentially taught him how to use realism and satire. Up until this point, Owen's style was still heavily influenced by those romantic notions of honor and beauty.
Keats and Shelley.
Yeah. But Sassoon's emphasis was on writing from direct, brutal experience. He taught Owen to focus on gritty realism to shock the civilian population out of their complacency.
And that is the alchemy of Wilfred Owen's work. He didn't just become a Sassoon clone. He took Sassoon's gritty realism and fused it with his own romantic sensibilities and immense technical skill.
Right.
This synthesis created a poetic voice that was intensely potent, highly visual, and deeply sympathetic. It's a style beautifully summarized by Owen's own famous phrase describing his subject matter, the pity of war.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Owen eventually surpassed his mentor technically. Sassoon's poetry was amazing at delivering a blunt, satirical punch. But Owen started experimenting extensively with innovative poetic techniques that changed English literature. The source highlights his use of something called pararhyme and his heavy reliance on assonance.
Which requires a bit of explanation for those of us who haven't sat in a literature seminar recently.
Please do.
Assonance is the repetition of vowel sounds to create a mood. But pararhyme, which Owen pioneered the heavy use of, is when the consonants match but the vowels don't. So instead of a perfect, satisfying rhyme like cat and hat, you rhyme flesh with flash or groined with groaned.
Right, and the text points out how brilliant this was for his subject matter. By using pararhyme, he deliberately denies the reader the comfort and resolution of a perfect rhyme.
Yes.
It creates this unsettling, incomplete, dissonant sound. When you read a poem like Strange Meeting, the rhyming of escaped and scooped literally sounds like the broken, jarring reality of the war itself. The language is musically reflecting the trauma.
It is brilliant structural engineering in his poetry. And it's important to note that while his artistic life was expanding at Craiglockhart, his personal life was experiencing a parallel awakening.
This is a huge part of the story.
Through Sassoon, Owen was introduced to a sophisticated homosexual literary circle. This network included Robbie Ross, who was famously a loyal friend and literary executor for Oscar Wilde,
Wow.
as well as the writer Osbert Sitwell and C.K. Scott Moncrief, the Scottish writer who would go on to translate Marcel Proust.
I was really struck by how massive this exposure was for him. Coming from somewhat sheltered religious background, Meeting this group broadened his worldview significantly.
It did. This introduction to a supportive literary and artistic circle gave Owen the confidence he needed to incorporate homoerotic elements into his own work. People who knew him intimately, like Robert Graves and Cheverell Sitwell, firmly believed Owen was homosexual and that homoeroticism was a central driving element in much of his poetry.
Right.
The biographer Andrew Motion noted that Sassoon's homosexuality admitted Owen to a style of living and thinking that he found naturally sympathetic. It allowed him to write about the physical bodies of his fellow soldiers with a deep, tender intimacy that contrasted sharply with the mechanized slaughter around them.
But the sources reveal a really tragic layer to this part of his life. During Owen's lifetime, and for decades afterward, homosexual activity between men was a heavily punished criminal offense in the United Kingdom.
Yes.
Because of this, his posthumous legacy was severely censored. His own brother, Harold, was named as literary executor and went to great lengths to construct a sanitized image of Wilfred.
It's terrible to read about.
Harold literally took a penknife to Owen's private diaries and letters, scraping away words, crossing out names, and removing any passages he considered discreditable to obscure the account of his brother's sexual development.
And this academic and familial suppression wasn't just a brief hiccup. It lasted for the majority of the 20th century. It wasn't until 1987 that a major turning point occurred in Owen's scholarship.
1987.
Yeah. An article called The Truth Untold by Jonathan Cutbill was published in the New Statesman. Cutbill aggressively attacked this ongoing academic suppression of Owen as a poet of homosexual experience.
The details in that article recontextualize things that had been hiding in plain sight. For example, it revealed that a poem of Owen's called Shadwell Stare, which mainstream academics had previously dismissed as just a mysterious, atmospheric piece, was actually a straightforward elegy to homosexual soliciting.
Exactly.
Shadwell Stare was an area of the London docks that was widely renowned as a cruising ground.
It just shows how easily academics can miss the truth when they are looking through the lens of a preconceived myth. They were so invested in the image of the pious, tragic war hero that they assumed the poem was a Gothic ghost story.
Right.
They entirely ignored the lived reality of the man writing it. It reminds us how much of the person's truth can be erased by history when society deems it unacceptable. But Owen himself was intensely committed to truth, particularly the unvarnished truth of his era. Which brings us to the events of 1918.
Let's set the scene based on the timeline in the text. It's the summer of 1918. Sassoon has been shot in the head in an apparent friendly fire incident, and he is sent back to England on sick leave for the rest of the war. Meanwhile, Owen is safely stationed on home duty in Yorkshire. He could have stayed there indefinitely. The military considered him fit for home service. But he makes the monumental decision that he must return to the front line in France.
He saw it as a terrible, unavoidable duty. With Sassoon incapacitated and back in England, Owen felt he had to carry the torch.
He had to be the witness.
Exactly. He needed to ensure that the horrific realities of the war would continue to be reported to the public by someone who was actually in the mud. He felt a profound obligation to the men who were still out there fighting and dying. He couldn't abide the thought of writing about their suffering from the safety of an English drawing room.
When you read about Sassoon's reaction, it is intense. Sassoon was furious when he found out about this idea. He violently opposed Owen going back to the trenches. He famously threatened to stab him in the leg if he even tried to return.
A very Sassoon thing to say.
Yeah. Because of this fierce opposition, Owen actually kept his deployment a secret. He didn't inform Sassoon that he was returning to active service until he was already physically back in France, beyond Sassoon's reach.
Once back at the front, Owen proved his courage in a way that is almost hard to reconcile with his earlier shell shock. On October 1st, 1918, he led units of the 2nd Manchesters to storm several German strongpoints near the village of Joncourt.
Right.
His company commander became a casualty, so Owen assumed command. The military records state he showed fine leadership, resisted a heavy counterattack, and personally manipulated a captured enemy machine gun from an isolated position, inflicting considerable losses on the enemy.
And for this action, he was awarded the Military Cross. But the text makes an incredibly heartbreaking point about why he wanted that medal.
Yes.
He specifically sought out this award in order to justify himself as a war poet. He knew that a pacifist poet without a medal would be easily dismissed by the public as a coward. But a decorated officer with a Military Cross, that is a prophet they're forced to listen to.
It's a powerful motivation.
He felt he needed the ultimate military validation so the public at home would read his poetry about the horrors of the war and actually believe him.
It is a devastating commentary on the society of the time, that a poet felt he had to prove his bravery by participating in the slaughter just to earn the right to speak out against it.
And then the timeline delivers a staggering blow. On November 4th, 1918, Wilfred Owen is killed in action during the crossing of the Sambre Canal. He was just 25 years old.
So young.
This happened exactly 1 week, almost to the hour before the signing of the armistice, which ended the war.
The cruelty of that timing is immense, but the way his family received the news is even worse. His mother, Susan, was handed the telegram informing her of his death on Armistice Day itself.
Unbelievable.
She read the news of her son's death at the exact moment the church bells in Shrewsbury were ringing out in joyous celebration of the war ending.
So, what does this all mean? How do we measure the impact of a life cut so incredibly short? We see in the sources that his legacy wasn't actually universally praised at first.
That is correct. It is important to acknowledge the literary naysayers of the time. The most prominent was the famous poet William Butler Yeats.
Right.
Yeats aggressively excluded Owen from the Oxford Book of Modern Verse. He was brutal in his assessment, describing Owen's work as all blood, dirt, and sucked sugar stick. Yeats belonged to an older, more romantic tradition. He argued that in great poetry, a tragedy should be a joy to the man who dies, and that passive suffering is not a subject for poetry.
Which completely misses the point. The blood and dirt was exactly the point Owen was trying to make. He wanted you to feel the suffocation of a gas attack, so you wouldn't glorify the conflict. Thankfully, Yeats' view did not win out in the long run. Owen's legacy is massive and enduring.
Very much so.
He was heavily championed by Sassoon, who made sure his works were collected and printed, as well as the poet Edith Sitwell.
Yes, his work eventually achieved widespread acclaim and became the standard by which all war poetry is judged. In 1985, he was one of 16 great war poets, commemorated on a slate stone unveiled in Westminster Abbey's Poets' Corner.
A huge honor.
His poetry also served as the foundational text for Benjamin Britten's famous War Requiem, which was first performed in 1962 to consecrate the new Coventry Cathedral.
I was looking in the publication dates in our sources, and it blew my mind to realize only 5 of his poems were published while he was alive, and one of those was just a fragment.
Just 5.
He had plans for a whole volume of verse, had even written a preface for it declaring my subject is war and the pity of war, but he never lived to see it published. Yet, despite that, he became the defining voice of an entire generation.
It is a profound legacy, and I want to leave you with a final lingering thought to mull over today, something we haven't touched on yet regarding how he is remembered.
Okay.
When his mother, Susan, was tasked with choosing the inscription for his gravestone in northern France, she selected a line from one of his own poems, The End. The line she chose reads, "Shall life renew these bodies? Of a truth all death will he annul." But if you look at Owen's original manuscript, that line ended with a question mark. All death will he annul. It was a profound expression of theological doubt. By intentionally deleting that trailing question mark for the gravestone, she transformed his agg-raising question into a definitive statement of faith.
That is such a striking paradox. His family desperately tried to edit out his doubts and his authentic self to make him fit their ideal mold. Yet it is exactly his raw, uncensored, unpious honesty about the realities of human suffering that made his work immortal. He refused to look away from the ugly truth in his poetry, even while his loved ones tried to soften the complex truth of the man himself after he was gone. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the life and mind of Wilfred Owen. Carry that thought with you, and we will see you next time.